Welcome to session 12, the 144,000 raptured to heaven. And are there two raptures? Let's find out. What has happened on earth since session 11 and today's session? Well, the first woe has passed, which consisted of plagues of locust demons being released from the bottomless pit to torment the people for 5 months. The second woe has passed, which consisted of the release of the 4 angels from the Euphrates River, who kills 1/3 of mankind with a 200 million man army. The third woe has passed, which consisted of Satan being cast from heaven down to earth, going after the 140,000 marked Jews and anyone else he could persecute. Also, the rising of the Antichrist has passed, the positioning of the false prophet and the false religion he brings has passed, and lastly, the taking of the mark of the beast, which was 666, limiting those who refused the mark to starvation and oppression. Now let's go back to heaven, and this is going to bring us to Revelations 14:1, where we see the same 144,000 as in Revelation 7, standing with the Lamb, Jesus, on Mount Zion. Let's look at why we think this group in chapter 14 is the same group that's in chapter 7. Comparing Revelation 7, 3 and 4 and Revelations 14, we discover the numbers the same, 144,000. Also, both groups have seals on their forehead. But let's dig a little bit deeper. We know from Revelation 7, this group is a select group from the tribes of Israel. But how do we know the second group in Revelations 14 is the same select group of Jews? Revelation 14:2 tells us they're playing harps. And throughout the Bible, we have the record of the Jewish people being harp players. Let's keep digging. Remember last session, we were introduced to the woman with the sun, moon, and stars. And she gave birth to a man-child, and it was caught up to God in his throne. A man-child. Okay. Man-child indicates an adult and not just a male baby. If the woman represents Israel being a group of people, then the child must represent a group of people also. The man-child is not Jesus, for Jesus is already in heaven. The man-child represents the 144,000 Jews, which were marked in Revelation 7. Satan couldn't devour the child, for they had been sealed and protected. The 144,000 have survived the first 6 trumpets and now are caught up to heaven. There's your rapture, caught up just like the church was caught up in the rapture to heaven to take their place beside Christ as the rulers in the new kingdom. Revelations 14:4 gives us more unique qualifications of these men. These are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they're virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among the men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, for they were without fault before the throne of God. You know, my thoughts go along the line of while they were on earth for 3.5 years, this group followed the instructions given to them and preached the gospel. They stayed focused, didn't get involved with finding a wife, were honest, and didn't sin. At the end of their assignment, they were raptured to heaven. But what about being first fruits? This kind of intrigued me a little bit. Feast of First Fruits is celebrated on the 14th of Nisan, which is March-April time frame for us, followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which starts on the next day, the 15th day. This feast lasts for 6 days, ending on the 21st day. The day after the Sabbath of Unleavened Bread, we have the Feast of First Fruits, and it's celebrated when the barley harvest starts. In Leviticus 23:10-14, we find no one was to eat any of the grain from the barley harvest until the first sheaf of the harvest, barley, was brought to the priest, who in turn waved it before God. Here's the cool part. Remember all those Old Testament saints from before the cross in session 6 that came out of the grave and were seen in Jerusalem? It was at this time, the start of the barley harvest, was when they were seen. Christ, as the holy priest, went to paradise, then taking them to heaven to present them to God as the first fruits of the barley harvest, or feast of fruits. 1 Corinthians 15:20 confirms this by saying, Christ has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. 1 Corinthians 15:23 tells us how the harvest is to be completed. But there is an order to this resurrection. Christ is raised as the first of the harvest, then also who belong to Christ will be raised when he comes back. The rapture. This completes the barley harvest and the feast of first fruits. Barley harvest first fruits are the Old Testament saints, and the harvest is completed with the rapture of the church. But what about the 144,000 and them also being called first fruits? I'm going to go somewhere with this. Just give me a minute. We have to discuss the Feast of Weeks, which is the next festival in the order of feast. Feast of Weeks is a celebration of the wheat harvest, and it too has a first fruit presented to the priest. This feast occurs on the 6th of Sivan, which is the May-June time frame. If the rapture, the church fulfills the first fruits, the barley harvest, is it possible that another group of people will fulfill the wheat harvest? A couple of points to consider. Remember back in session 9 in our first group of people we met in heaven? And hopefully you remember they were under God's throne, under the altar in God's throne room. Where does the priest take the offering of the first fruit? To the altar. These folks could be the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Then in session 10, we meet the second group of people. Remember, they're holding palm branches. And where are they recorded as being? In God's throne room. I believe this group of people represents the wheat harvest of the Feast of Weeks. But wait, the Feast of Weeks includes any first fruits of any harvest. In other words, the owner of a vineyard would take their first ripe grapes, which they had produced into wine, to the temple and present the priest with their offering as the Lord's first fruit. Now for the 144,000 being first fruits. Hosea gives us a little bit of insight. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness, saw their fathers as the first fruits in the fig tree in its first season. But they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves to that shame. They became an abomination like the things they loved. God compares Israel to grapes, and what a blessing it is in his big plan for them. He also sees them as being the first fruits. But Israel went into sin and God rejects them, not accepting them as being his first fruits of the Feast of Weeks harvest of fruit. Baal Peor was similar to Sodom and Gomorrah. Numbers 25 tells us of an event where God told Moses to slay every man and woman who went to Baal Peor, killing 24,000 Israelites. So I wonder if this is why the first qualifications of this 144,000 men is listed as one of the ones who were not defiled with women, for they were virgins. Could be. So the first fruits of the grape harvest of the Feast of Weeks are the marked 144,000 from Revelation 17 and 14. The harvest is completed by the group we're going to meet in our next session, 13. But I want to go one step further, if you can hang with me. We're quickly going to look at the Levitical feast and special days in the Old Testament versus the Levitical feast and special days in the millennial reign, which takes place after Christ's return. Notice, the Feast of Firstfruits and Feast of Weeks are not celebrated in the millennial reign. The Feast of Trumpets was to recognize the end of the harvest year, which will be completed. With 1 Thessalonians 14:16 references this trumpet being blown at the first of the tribulation period. Remember, we talked about that earlier. It's that nobody can miss loud trumpet. The Day of Atonement will not be needed because the Jews will recognize Jesus as their Messiah. God releases them from their spiritual blindness as they come to faith in Christ. Okay, that's today's session. I pray you got something out of all that. I know the study guide was very vague on the feast, so I had to add all this additional information to make sense for you. Now for the boxes in our worksheet. Erase the blue box with a star on the earth in the tribulation section and draw a new blue box with a star under God's throne below the millennial section. Just as a reminder, this blue box with a star represents the marked 144,000 Israelite Jews. Hope to see you next time. Shalom.